This is 1976 F1 World Champion James Hunt.
Just a minute, I haven't done my hair yet. I'm not ready to go on the telly.
Remembered for the thrilling championship fight with Ferrari's Niki Lauda that served as inspiration for the film Rush, many dismissed Hunt the Shunt's chances of even getting to F1, let alone holding its ultimate prize. But the most important moment on Hunt's path to F1 stardom might not be the races won in lower formula, but when two men did a very dodgy car buying deal in 1967. In November 1967, at the Church of the Immaculate Conception in London's Farm Street, racing driver Charles Lucas married socialite Antoinette von Westenholz. Lucas had invited his friends, impecunious sometime racing driver Anthony Bubbles Horsley and Thomas Alexander Fermor-Hesketh, the third Baron Hesketh, who was better known simply as Lord Hesketh. Like Horsley, Hesketh was an eccentric, larger-than-life character, and crucially, he had the financial wherewithal and the drive to get things done.
Horsley spotted an opportunity to offload a Bentley to Hesketh, but instead, he found himself coming out on the worst side of a deal to buy a Mercedes from the 17-year-old nobleman. Despite this, the two men formed a friendship through which they would meet many of the popular characters of the day on the racing scene, not least racer Piers Courage and racer and racing car salesman Frank Williams. Via a tortuous route, that ill-starred matrimonial deal set up a chain of events that wound up 9 years later, turning a serial car crasher into an F1 world champion.
Thank you. Did we really win?
When they told me, they didn't look very convinced, and I didn't want to believe anybody and then get disappointed after all the disappointments I've had this year. So I said, I want to see this in writing.
As the Lucases were married in Surrey's opulent Belmont village, stockbroker's son James Hunt had been cutting his teeth racing a Mini, graduating to Formula Ford single-seaters for 1968. In 1970, he graduated to Formula 3, 2 steps below his target of Formula 1.
Formula 3 is essential to a driver's training because it teaches you, the dangers and pitfalls of close racing. So it basically teaches you how to crash or not to crash, depending and get tangled up with others, depending on your inclinations.
He was very quick, but hot-headed, and his mercurial talent sometimes saw him distinguished more for numerous crashes that earned him the disparaging nickname Hunt the Shunt. Despite that, he earned a drive on merit with the March Factory or Works team for 1972, but was sacked after a dispute in Monaco with team founder Max Mosley. Their relationship was already failing through mutual disappointment. Hunt's with what he saw as mechanical shortcomings, political manoeuvring, shambolic management, and the car's lack of performance. Mosley with Hunt's propensity to have expensive accidents. The prestigious Monaco F3 supported the famous Grand Prix and could thus propel the winner into Formula 1. But his car arrived late and wasn't ready for first practice. Frustrated, Hunt made a side deal with his old friend Chris Marshall that if his works car's engine didn't fire up first time when he went out to qualify, he would switch to Marshall's car, which he'd raced in 1971. He duly qualified in the older machine when the works car did fail to start. Mosley threatened that if he didn't race the works car, he would be sacked. Hunt was convinced that cash-strapped March had confected the whole disagreement and sabotaged him so they could run German Jochen Mass in the car, with much-needed backing from Ford. So he raced the Marshall March instead of his works car, and his sacking came shortly after. Left without a Works F3 drive, he again drove Marshall's March on the infamously fast track called Chimay in Belgium. A week later. He was often sick with nerves prior to a race, but settled down once he was at the wheel. Hunt had the speed, but not a permanent race seat. And so in that new moment of despair, Chimay would be the place where the disparate threads that would take him to global stardom were pulled closer together.
At that point, things were looking very bleak. I had no sponsorship. I was earning no money from racing. In fact, I had a particularly unsuccessful time in Formula 3 as related to what I considered to be my ability, and subsequently found out that I was correct on that.
Also in Chimay that weekend were Bubbles Horsley and Lord Hesketh, the latter having formed Hesketh Racing. Hunt didn't know that at the beginning of that 1972 season, Horsley had investigated via a third party the possibility of offering him a drive, having been impressed by the speed he'd shown in Marshall's March in F3 the previous year. Now Horsley went in search of Hunt, who serendipitously was also looking for him, seeing Horsley as perhaps his last resort, his plan B, the only man left in F3 who might have a car that he would allow him to race. They met, by happenstance, in the rough Belgian field that served as the paddock. Two men who hadn't quite realised by this point that they desperately needed one another. They adjourned to a First World War army tent which served as the event's meeting place, and Horsley was soon convinced enough to offer Hunt a drive in the team's second car. Hunt, with nothing else on the horizon, agreed. It would be the best decision he would make in his racing career. But first, he had to be vetted by Hesketh, and his lordship's first impressions weren't altogether favourable. Besides Hunt's reputation as a crasher, Hesketh wasn't impressed by the appearance of this gangling, blonde, long-haired, knock-kneed youth, nor with how pleased Hunt appeared to be with himself. The two met in a Belgian cafe, and Hesketh's assessment of Hunt were cast aside by Horsley's recommendations. Hunt was signed as his second driver there and then, on the back of a beer mat. Hunt didn't know it, but he'd just landed on his feet. The big time was finally beckoning, but the road would be circuitous. Crashes were common, and damage was high. This sort of racing record could be enough to see Hunt the shunt without a drive, and cripple the team with damage bills. Hesketh was a maverick, however, and far from a typical team patron. Most would have opted either to rebuild the cars or to quit. Instead, since difficulties merely acted as a spur to him, he decided to double down. He and Horsley bullied Moseley into lending them a year-old March, and graduated to Formula 2 one step below F1. And in that car, Hunt starred in an unusual race at Brands Hatch at the end of August. This was a one-off race that was not part of any championship, but F1, F2 and Formula 5000 single-seaters all raced together in a free-for-all which boasted an overall prize fund of £50,000. F1 cars filled the top three places, with winner Emerson Fittipaldi taking £10,000 for Lotus. But a strong fifth place demonstrated Hunt's sudden maturity and began to change opinions about him. It seemed the more power Hunt had, the better he drove. Overnight, Hunt had turned his reputation around. Hesketh thus continued to race in Formula 2 in 1973 with a new Surtees car, but also let Hunt have an outing in a hired Surtees TS9B F1 machine in the non-championship F1 Race of Champions at Brands Hatch in March. The car was well worn, but he finished right alongside the second-placed McLaren of 1967 world champion Denny Hulme, and later cursed Horsley for giving him pit signals urging caution. Without them, he believed he could and should have won. The Surtees F2 car disappointed against the strong BMW-supported Works March team, and after just a few races, Hesketh decided it was time to double down again. He did another deal with Moseley, this time to lease a March F1 car for £8,000. Bought two Ford Cosworth DFB engines, and suddenly, Hesketh Racing was an F1 team. And they were the talk of Monte Carlo for both their ostentatious support yacht in the harbour and Hunt's debut performance in the Monaco Grand Prix. But even better was to come. With its brash approach and its Super Bear logo, which Hesketh had heavily borrowed after buying a postcard featuring Dick Bruner's illustrated character, the biggest little racing team in the world proved the surprise of the season. As Jackie Stewart won his third and final title prior to retirement, Hunt finished 6th in France, 4th in Britain, 3rd in Holland, and 2nd in America. Hesketh's image of aristocratic alcohol and caviar-consuming hedonism continued to upset people in some sensitive circles in the F1 paddock. but beneath the high-flying glitz and slightly childish imagery and nicknames lay a team of dedicated mechanics, the steel of Horsley's management, and the talent of design engineer Dr. Harvey Postlethwaite, who would later star at Tyrrell and Ferrari. The British public loved it all. "You know, I have a theory about rich people," and Alexander in particular, Hunt once said, "that when they touch something, it turns to gold." After all, nobody was prepared to give any sort of chance to a new Formula One team managed by someone called Bubbles Horsley and with a driver named James Hunt. Hesketh made their own car for 1974 to Postlethwaite's design, and in another impressive season, Hunt won the non-championship international trophy race at Silverstone and several podiums in the championship. While Hesketh were making waves with their new car, established Brazilian star and 1972 world champion Emerson Fittipaldi, unsettled by Ronnie Peterson's speed alongside him at Lotus in 1973, went looking for a fresh berth for 1974. He was offered his choice of teams by Marlboro as they decided to switch their budget from the failing BRM enterprise. He visited Brabham, Tyrrell and McLaren, and was blown away by what he saw in McLaren's Woking factory. They proved a wise choice, and he became world champion for the second time.
Congratulations, Emerson. Thank you very much. Fantastic.
And the team won their first Constructors' World Championship that season. Hunt was 8th, behind the established teams. But things were happening elsewhere too. After driving for Brabham, Fittipaldi's older brother Wilson ambitiously set up his own team for 1975. The Fittipaldi Ford FD01, designed by family friend Ricardo de Vida, was lucratively sponsored by the National Sugar Marketing Corporation, Copersucar. This would open up the final, crucial stage in Hunt's ultimate graduation. Hesketh updated their car for 1975, and only a spin prevented Hunt winning in Argentina, where Emerson Fittipaldi scored instead for McLaren. Hunt nevertheless finished second, but his greatest race came in Holland, when he was still racing the older car. Hard driving and canny pit work in a race that started wet but dried out saw Hunt hold his nerve to score a sensational but narrow win over his old friend Lauda in the more powerful Ferrari that would take the Austrian to that year's championship. It was Hunt's first Grand Prix victory, and rapturous delight embraced the little team as everyone happily imbibed champagne and all the doubters and naysayers suddenly became their best friends.
I think winning grows on you, makes you more competitive. It did after I won my first Grand Prix.
Autosport wrote of the lap of honour, his lordship, virtue triumphant incarnate, almost floated onto the back of the flower-garlanded lorry, and his face shining with effervescent ecstasy, rode backwards along the entire front row of the pits, saluting his rival teams with a peculiarly English digital gesture. It was one Winston Churchill had made popular years before. Hunt and Hesketh finished the year 4th overall, behind Lauda and Ferrari, Fittipaldi and McLaren, and Carlos Reutemann and Brabham. That trio may have had up to 3 times the £412,000 that Hesketh calculated they needed for 1976. Behind the scenes, commercial reality had been biting Alexander Hesketh mercilessly. Though F1 was undoubtedly much less expensive than it is today, it still demanded deep pockets, and Hesketh was finally forced to face the economics of his situation. Unable to source a sponsor, he was up against it. Rumours of imminent closure appeared in the media on November the 10th, and as Hesketh himself was awarded a British Racing Drivers Club gold medal at a chilly Thruxton circuit on the 15th, it served as a poignant elegy. He confirmed that the team could not afford to race on into 1976. With their larger-than-life lord and his wild young playboy with the Union Jack on his helmet, Hesketh Racing had given British racegoers exactly what they needed in the post-Jackie Stewart era. But now it appeared that the party was over, as quickly as it had begun.
Naturally, I was disappointed that Hesketh Racing had finished. I'd always hoped that I'd be able to serve out my career and do the whole thing with one team, and they'd started me off, and I was sad to lose that and that they had to go. But, of course, everything marches on.
Possibly just before the Thruxton farewell, and if not, then certainly very soon afterwards, Hunt never did fully divulge, he received a call from Domingos Piedade, Emerson Fittipaldi's manager. It was a courtesy call that Fittipaldi had specifically asked him to make, and the news the German-domiciled Brazilian imparted was sensational. Emerson was leaving McLaren to join his brother's Copersucar Fittipaldi operation. Hunt immediately spoke with John Hogan, his friend who dealt with all of Marlborough's racing business, having straight away realised what all of this meant. McLaren team boss Teddy Mayer did the same.
Well, frankly, last summer I was talking about retiring, but at the time there were only 2 drivers on my replacement list. One was Nicky Lauda, who's a current world champion, and the other one was James. You want someone who's physically fit and able. You want someone who's determined. You want someone who's proven that he's fast.
Like Hunt and Horsley 3.5 years earlier, suddenly Hunt and Mayer needed each other. Some people at Marlborough were not sure about Hunt, but as the Briton swapped one Teddy for another, Mayer certainly was. I barely finished saying goodbye to Emerson before I got onto James and asked if he would drive for us, Mayer revealed. Within 36 hours, we had concluded a deal. Ironically, given the warmth of their relationship, what was Hesketh's saddest moment proved to be the springboard for Hunt's biggest career break. This put Hunt at one of F1's biggest teams, racing on a par with Ferrari, Lotus, Brabham and Tyrrell up at the sharp end. He had the equipment to win, but also the expectation of a team used to winning. And he did, eventually, but it was Lauda who dominated initially. Hunt would often start from pole, but see Lauda beat him to the finish line.
Started doing the winning, and he's kept the habit, and I've been just behind him. But it only, it just needs the straw to break the camel's back.
Hunt took his first victory with McLaren in Spain, but was disqualified when his car was deemed 1/8 of an inch too wide at the rear.
The thing is, it's out of my jurisdiction, I don't know how wide it is anyway, I didn't even know there was a rule about it.
But was subsequently reinstated the day after he won the French Grand Prix. He wasn't so lucky in Britain, where he was disqualified for breaking a rule prior to a restart. That handed his on-the-road victory to Lauda, whom he'd overtaken to the delight of the partisan crowd, which had threatened to riot if their man hadn't been allowed to take the restart. Lauda then had a huge crash on the opening lap of the German Grand Prix on the infamous Nürburgring.
I always knew that my job is a dangerous one, so when I had my accident I was at least not surprised to have an accident, because it is unfortunately part of the game. But that I got hurt so bad for sure was not a good experience for me, and the only thing I did afterwards is to try to get as quick fit as possible.
And in a spectacularly courageous recovery, he returned to racing at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, having effectively only missed 3 races. In the meantime, Enzo Ferrari had replaced him with Carlos Reutemann. And Hunt had won in Germany and Holland, and finished 4th in Austria.
James, terrific. You're 2 points behind in the world title. What's the pressure like to be like that?
Well, it's a nice position to be in, but it doesn't half put the pressure on. What it really means now is that whatever I do at Monza, when Nicky comes back in Canada, that the situation is going to be very, very close, and so it's going to be a hell of a fight to the finish. So, I'm looking forward to seeing Nicky back racing, but I'm not looking forward to the hard battle that we're going to have, because it's going to be really tough.
And if he comes back at Monza, what do you think?
Well, it starts all the sooner.
It was suddenly very important for me that Nicky should live, in a way I hadn't realised, Hunt said of his friend and rival. And I felt awful, because there was nothing I could do about it. As Lauda drove to a superb 4th place at Monza, beating teammates Regazzoni and Reutemann after forcing Ferrari to run 3 cars, Hunt was the subject of spurious accusations about the legality of his McLaren's fuel, and started from the back of the grid.
They quite simply and straightforwardly set us up. They claimed that our fuel was illegal, which it wasn't, and they produced extremely sketchy evidence to support that claim, which they knew was wrong. But they also knew they could get away with it because but apart from the fact, had it been illegal, we were entitled to appeal, and subject to appeal, they had no right to put us at the back of the grid anyway. And because you can't send a man to prison until he's been found guilty, and we hadn't been found guilty at that moment because they'd accepted our notice of appeal.
Incensed, he crashed after 11 laps. But with another victory in Canada, he went to the penultimate race in America in contention for the title. On October the 10th, the morning of the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, Hunt intended to rise at 8 o'clock as usual on race day. He and Lauda had been a little tetchy with one another of late, thanks to a couple of tense discussions over safety, the pressure of the championship fight and the media playing up their supposed rivalry. But they'd sorted that out between themselves, and their friendship remained intact. The door that adjoined their rooms at the Glen Motor Inn in upstate New York was still unlocked after they'd been socializing the previous evening, as was their wont. At 7 o'clock, knowing full well that Hunt would still be sleeping prior to his alarm call, Lauda marched boldly into his room, fully dressed in his racing kit. He stood to attention by Hunt's bedside before declaring, "Today, I win the championship," and marched back out. Hunt thought his friend's prank was hilarious. But Lauda didn't clinch the title. Hunt overtook Jody Scheckter to win again, as Lauda was a distant third. They now went to the finale in Japan, under the shadow of Mount Fuji, with Lauda on 68 points, Hunt on 65. But it was the latter who still had a mountain of his own to climb. The conditions for the Japanese race were horrendous, but the race went ahead. Several drivers, notably Lauda, Emerson Fittipaldi, Carlos Pace, and it was rumoured Hunt himself, spoke of starting but then stopping at the end of the first lap. But as the adrenaline surged, none of them did. But Lauda stopped at the end of the second and climbed out of a healthy car. With the same courage with which he'd made his return, he candidly confessed to his team that with his eyelids still scarred from his German accident, he couldn't see properly, especially in all the spray, and that it made no sense to continue. Now Hunt just needed to finish third to become champion, but his tyres were wearing out as the track dried. As he waited for a signal telling him to pit, the team waited for him to make the decision. In the end, he just managed to swerve into the pits as first his left rear tyre and then the left front punctured. He rejoined in 5th place.
You know, those sort of races are pretty chaotic as far as lap charting is concerned, especially right at the end when several people were coming in and out of the pits for tyres, and my pit didn't really know what the exact race positions were, and I was getting pretty jumbled signals. I mean, it didn't matter because once I was out on the track again after my pit stop, and they did a fantastic job changing the wheel, all I could do was drive as fast as I could and pass any car that I saw, if I could.
Mario Andretti won from Patrick Depailler, but Lauda would be the champion after all if Hunt stayed 5th. When he came into the pits afterwards, Hunt raged at Teddy Mayer, convinced the tyre indecision had cost him the title. But he had unknowingly overtaken both the struggling Regazzoni and Alan Jones's Surtees, and amid chaotic scenes, Mayer held up 3 fingers to indicate to him that he had regained the 3rd place he needed.
When they told me, they didn't look very convinced, and I didn't want to believe anybody and then get disappointed after all the disappointments I've had this year. There's no way I was going to let this happen, so I said I want to see this in writing.
Give me a drink. Congratulations, James. Fantastic. Thank you. Did we really win?
So the fairy tale rags to riches story really did become fact. After heartbreak and disappointment in his early racing years, James Hunt had pursued Lady Luck all the way, and when he finally seduced her, his own talent, determination, and self-belief were the final factors that secured his rise to the top of the world. But that race-winning talent may have never been seen had so many small moments not occurred in this chain reaction. If Fittipaldi had stayed put at McLaren and Hesketh quietly faded as quickly as it had risen. If Hesketh Racing hadn't dealt its way to F3 and F2 at the right time, or looking back to the 1960s, if Hesketh and Horsley had never met at a socialite's wedding, this small butterfly effect would have led to an F1 era in which fans had never heard of Hesketh, the Super Bear, or even seen James Hunt race, let alone join the ranks of F1 champions.